Eventually, the exam results were published. Vera got a first division pass with distinctions in mathematics, biology, physics, geography, and English, and credits in chemistry and literature. She also managed a pass in needlework, which pleased her immensely because she had feared that she would fail the confounded subject. She hated to fail and therefore suffered the needle pricks gladly. Becky managed a second division pass with which she was well pleased, as were her parents. Tony, whose calm assurance had begun to show signs of cracking, surpassed his wildest dreams by obtaining a perfect score of 36 points. He held himself tightly and then let out a last yell. "Watch out, guys! Here I come!" he shouted. Elizabeth, who had a particularly soft spot for this son, smiled at him. "You worked for it. I am sure Auro is dying to know. You must write and tell him." "That's a great idea." He ran on ahead. His joy simply could not be contained by a steady pace. Becky wanted to look for a job immediately. It would mean freedom, and she craved freedom. Mark could not hear of it. His breathtaking 18-year-old daughter, out in the streets full of predatory men by herself? Never. That cannot be. Young lady, you're going right back to your old school to study for your advanced level certificate in history, literature, and geography, just like they have told you to. "But father, all I want is to be an air hostess. Why should I go back to school? That's for Vera, who wants to be a professor." "An air hostess?" Mark could not believe his ears. "Over my dead body." Becky looked at his face and retreated to her room. She remembered the story of Aoro and his near starvation. She would bide her time. No use in antagonizing the old geezer. Vera enthusiastically took on mathematics, physics, and chemistry. This time, she said goodbye to her sister and left without a backward glance. Tony left to join Aoro, and his mother's heart went with him. Soon the house echoed with emptiness, for even little Mary was away at school throughout the day. The children were growing up and the going away movement was becoming an exodus. Elizabeth wished that the twin boys were with her to fill the house with noise and good cheer. One day, a telegram arrived from Alur. Now, letters from that place were few and far between. They mainly consisted of notes from the twins asking for this, that, or the other. A telegram rarely ever carried good news, and Mark's hands shook a little as he tore it open. "Come," it declared. "Your mother is very ill." It must be Maria. He rushed out of his office and went to get his wife. She was in the middle of a lesson, and one of the teachers had to call her out. One look at Mark's face was enough. He had never been much good at hiding things behind a blank mask, and Elizabeth could read him like a book. "What is wrong?" He said nothing, just quietly handed her the telegram. "Mother ill? But she was so well when we went to see her last month." Oh my God, we must go at once." "Yes, dear. I've already spoken to the headmaster, so just get into the car and we'll go right home." Firm, decisive Elizabeth was standing there looking confused and unsure of her next action. When they got home, she walked into the sitting room and again just stood there. She had the most oppressive premonition of doom pressing in on her from all sides, and she simply could not make any sensible move. So Mark took over, packed a few things for her, made arrangements with the neighbors to collect little Mary, put his wife in the car, and drove off. Most children have a father and a mother, and Elizabeth had been no exception, apart from the fact that her father figure had been a woman, her grandmother Akoko. Now, her mother was ill, probably dying, and she experienced a completely different pain from the one she had experienced at her grandmother's death. There is a bond that exists between mother and child that is completely primeval in nature, only comes to the surface of the conscious mind in all its primitive force when either mother or child is in some sort of peril. Not surprising, considering that as a child lies in its mother's womb, the first sound it hears is her heartbeat, and the first human voice it recognizes is hers. For the next many months, the child's most satisfying experience will be to lie next to her heart, nursing at the breast so that the powerful connection is not severed with the cutting of the umbilical cord. Maria Nyabera had been a good mother to Elizabeth and her cousin Peter, and in her own generous way had given unstintingly of herself to them and to her own mother. Elizabeth remembered how tenderly she had looked after Akoko when she became old and ailing, and she hoped with a sick, despairing dread that she would get the same chance to show her mother how much she cared in spite of the distance between them. "I have failed her." These were the first words she had spoken since their departure from Nakuru, and now they were approaching the outskirts of the town of Kericho. Mark cautioned himself to tread carefully, for he remembered only too clearly how she had almost broken off their engagement at her grandmother's death, blaming him for God alone knew what. "How have you failed, dear?" he asked cautiously. "Don't keep on calling me dear. You know very well I should have visited her more frequently instead of just staying with you, who are young and healthy and don't need me." Mark knew better than to point out that not more than 2 months had ever passed without Elizabeth dashing west to see her mother, or the great sacrifice that they had both made in giving up 2 of their children to harm. He knew her well enough to know that she would only bite off his head, and he liked it well enough where it was, firmly attached to his body. He was lucky, for he had many brothers staying at home with his own mother, so he didn't have to constantly worry on that score. He really understood her predicament. "You don't understand anything at all," the lady declared as if reading his mind. "You don't know how torn I've often felt, how I long to divide myself in 2 so that I can be in both places at once." Mark said nothing, but thought to himself that marriage was a very useful thing. There was always someone to vent one's fury on, however unjustifiably. Elizabeth kept on alternating between long silences and irrational, self-accusatory statements until they were a few miles from Allure. She then kept completely quiet. It was dark by then, but when they approached the hut, they found a crowd of people gathered there, and both their hearts sank. She must be dead. The twins rushed out into their parents' arms, and the people surrounded them. But Elizabeth had no eyes for anyone. She just walked into the hut. She had to see that beloved face one last time. "She's not here. Father Thomas took her to the hospital at Maseno." So she was not dead yet. Thank God. It must have been 8 o'clock, but she simply turned on her heels and went out to the car again, despite the protest of the villagers. This night will not pass without her seeing her mother. Mark and the twins followed her out. They knew that arguments was of no use. When they finally reached Maseno at about 9 o'clock, they had to plead to be allowed in. They found Maria, who had suffered a massive stroke, still in a coma. The clinical officer on duty held out no hope, but suggested they return in the morning to confirm with the doctor. It was then decided that Elizabeth will stay with her mother and Mark will take the children home. He would return in the morning. Elizabeth pulled up a stool and sat by her mother all that night, listening to the changing patterns of her breathing. First it was stertorous but steady, then she went into periodic breathing with lapses so long that her daughter, afraid that she had stopped altogether, would squeeze her hand, at which she would start breathing again. Once she actually opened her eyes, and Elizabeth tried to talk to her but got no response. She would have bombarded the nurses with her questions, but she was afraid they would throw her out. At 7 o'clock, just before the doctor came for his rounds, Maria Nyabera, daughter of Chief Owuor Kembo and Akoko Obanda and wife to Okumu Angolo, breathed her last, with her only daughter at her bedside. But death is such a lonely and private matter that all others, however loving, can only be observers. Elizabeth stood by that bedside for a long time. It is a strange feeling to realize that you are an orphan, even if you're 43, and that the one person who has always loved you without question is no more. Father Thomas, who had had a soft spot for this ever-smiling parishioner of his, was very helpful. He helped transport the body and assisted his lordship, Bishop Peter Kembo, with the Requiem Mass. Then the funeral procession with altar boys leading proceeded to the burial ground where Maria was laid to rest beside her mother. It was the end of an era. The year was 1973, almost 100 seasons after the girl child, Akoko Obanda, had arrived wailing into the world, the first daughter of the great Chief Oderogogni, by his second wife Akech. She it was who had been the source of this river, which at one point had trickled to a mere rivulet in danger of pattering out, but which once again, in her granddaughter Elizabeth and in her 7 children, was gathering momentum. The dead have no use for the living, who have eventually to tear themselves away so that the business of life might somehow continue. Elizabeth gathered her children and they left the fresh mound of red soil by itself in the hot afternoon sun. There were things to do. The heart had to be closed, a few cherished things taken, but most given away. The children had to go back to their various schools and she herself back to her house. There was nothing but memories to hold her to this place, her adoptive home to which she had come as a very little girl.